It all began on a quiet Thursday afternoon outside Oak Grove High School in Phoenix, Arizona. The last bell of the day had just rung, and students streamed out of the building, eager to escape the halls and head home. Among them was 13-year-old Lily Thompson, standing near the curb, eyes glued to her phone as she waited for her father to pick her up. Lily was a promising student, always at the top of her class, active in the science club, and well-loved for her warm heart. But what people noticed first was not her academic achievements, it was her hair. Thick, wavy, and always beautifully braided, her locks were a source of pride. It was something her mother had taught her to cherish from a young age, a part of her identity she wore with confidence. But on this particular afternoon, something was about to change. Lily stood there, lost in her thoughts, when the sound of a police siren grew louder. A black and white cruiser slowly rolled up and stopped just a few feet away. The door opened and Officer Daniels stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short-cropped hair, he had the sort of presence that made people take notice, as though he thought he was always in charge. His eyes scanned the area before locking onto Lily. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" His tone was casual, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that sent an uncomfortable shiver down her spine. Lily glanced up, surprised by the sudden attention. "I'm waiting for my dad," she said, sliding her phone into her jacket pocket, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniels took a step toward her, his gaze not leaving her face. "What's your name?" Lily hesitated. She didn't owe him an explanation, but something about the way he spoke made her feel like she had no choice. "Lily," she answered, her voice small. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his radio, his eyes never leaving her. "Possible match on the missing persons report," he said into the device. "White female, around 13, wearing a green jacket and black jeans." Lily's stomach dropped. "I'm not missing," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice firm. "I'm just waiting for my dad." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. He muttered something under his breath into the radio, then turned back to her. "Come with me, kid. We'll figure this out down at the station." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. "No, I didn't do anything wrong," she protested. The school parking lot was full of students, parents, and teachers, yet no one seemed to notice what was unfolding right in front of them. Her hands trembled as she tried to figure out what to do. Then, with a swift motion, Daniels reached for his handcuffs. Lily took a step back, panic rising in her throat. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice shaking. But he didn't listen. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. The sharp click of the cuffs was loud in her ears as they tightened around her small wrists, biting into her skin. A few students gasped. A teacher nearby, who had been watching from a distance, quickly moved toward them. "Officer, what's going on here?" the teacher asked, her voice filled with confusion. "Runaway," Daniels replied curtly, dismissively waving the concern away. The teacher frowned, her gaze shifting from the officer to Lily. "I know her." "She's not a runaway." Daniels barely glanced at the teacher. "That's for us to decide," he said, as if the matter was already settled. Lily's throat tightened as Officer Daniels shoved her toward the squad car. No one intervened, no one said a word, and just like that, she was being taken away. No explanation, no reason, and no one to stand up for her. But Lily wasn't just any kid, and Officer Daniels had no idea what he was about to unleash. The police cruiser pulled away from Oak Grove High. Lily pressed against the cold leather seat, hands still cuffed behind her back. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind spiraling. How is this happening? How could this happen? She turned toward the window, watching the school fade into the distance, panic clawing at her chest. She had seen stories like this on the news: wrongful detentions, racial profiling. But she never imagined she'd be living through one. Officer Daniels glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You got someone we should call? A parent?" he asked, his tone flat. "My dad," Lily responded, her teeth clenched in frustration. "He's on his way to pick me up. This is all a mistake." Daniels chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Yeah, every kid says that. Lily's heart pounded, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. I have my school ID in my bag. It proves who I am. You can call the school, they'll tell you I'm not a runaway. She pleaded, but Officer Daniels didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the road. We'll sort it out at the station, he muttered. Lily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This isn't right, she murmured under her breath. Daniels let out a dismissive scoff. Life's not fair, kid. The ride felt like an eternity. Each second dragged on longer than the last. By the time the car pulled into the Phoenix Police Department, her stomach was in knots. The cruiser slid through a narrow side entrance, coming to a stop in front of a dull gray steel door. Daniels got out first, then swung the back door open, grabbing her arm as if she were a criminal. Out, Lily stumbled as he tugged her inside past officers sitting at desks, typing and answering phones. Some glanced up, their eyes filled with curiosity, while others barely looked up. No one questioned why a young girl was being hauled through the station in cuffs. A female officer, Sergeant Williams, looked up from her paperwork and furrowed her brow. What's going on here? She asked, her voice sharp. Picked her up outside Oak Grove High. Matches a missing persons report, Daniels replied flatly, his expression impassive. Sergeant Williams' eyes narrowed. Are you sure about that? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Officer Daniels shrugged, clearly uninterested. Close enough, he said with a nonchalant tone. Lily's chest tightened. Close enough? Sergeant Williams studied Lily for a moment, her arms crossed. She doesn't look like a runaway to me. Lily saw her chance and seized it. I'm not. My name is Lily Thompson. My dad's on his way to pick me up. You can call my school, they'll tell you I'm not a runaway. Her voice was firm, though the nerves were evident beneath her words. Williams' lips pressed into a thin line. Did you search her? Daniels exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. She's a kid. What could she possibly be hiding? Policy, Williams replied, her voice carrying authority. And take off the cuffs, she's not resisting. Daniels rolled his eyes but finally unlocked the cuffs. Lily rubbed her sore wrists, blinking away frustrated tears as she tried to regain some sense of control. Take her to holding, Daniels muttered before walking off, leaving Lily with the officer. Lily's heart sank. Holding, Sergeant Williams seemed hesitant, but gave a small nod toward a door at the end of the hall. Come on, sweetheart. Lily followed her, feeling every step like a weight dragging her down. They walked through a narrow corridor until they reached a small room with gray walls and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Sit, Williams said, gesturing to a hard plastic chair. Lily sat down, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I don't belong here. Williams sighed, a note of sympathy in her eyes, but her voice was steady. I know. She began typing something into the computer. Let's see if we can get this sorted out. But before she could do anything further, Officer Daniels reappeared in the doorway, holding a pair of scissors in one hand. Lily's heart stopped. We need to cut her hair, Daniels said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing something entirely mundane. Williams frowned, confusion crossing her face. Excuse me? Standard procedure, Daniels replied dismissively. Sanitation reasons, Williams shook her head firmly. That's not a thing. Daniels smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Well, it is now. Lily's hands gripped the sides of the chair, her body stiffening. You can't do this, she shouted, panic rising in her chest. Daniel's smirk didn't fade. Watch me. And that's when everything changed. What had started as a terrible misunderstanding was about to spiral into something far worse. Lily's body went rigid. Her fingers dug into the plastic seat beneath her as she stared at the scissors in Daniel's hand, fear flooding her veins. You can't, she stammered. You can't just cut my hair. Daniels shrugged nonchalantly. It's policy. Sergeant Williams' expression darkened, a hard edge to her voice. No, it's not. Daniels let out a dry laugh. twirling the scissors between his fingers as if they were a toy. "Well, let's call it new policy then. Kids come in, we make sure they're clean. That hair of hers, who knows what could be in it?" Lily's breath caught in her throat. "There's nothing in my hair." "You're just trying to humiliate me." Daniels tilted his head, his grin widening. "Or maybe I'm just following procedure. Now sit still, or I'll have to do this the hard way." Lily's hands shot up to protect her hair, but before she could react, Officer Daniels grabbed the back of her jacket and yanked her forward. "Stop!" Sergeant Williams' voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. "This isn't happening." Daniels turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "Are you interfering with an officer's duty, Sergeant?" "I'm interfering with whatever power trip you're on," Williams shot back, her voice filled with determination. The two locked eyes in a silent battle, but Daniels was relentless. He turned back to Lily and grabbed a fistful of her hair. Lily screamed, her body thrashing in the chair, kicking out in desperation. But Daniels was stronger. His grip tightened, yanking her head back. Williams lunged forward, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "That's enough. Let go." Daniels growled under his breath. "She's just a kid." "She's a suspect," Williams snapped. Williams stepped between them, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "You want to violate a child, you do it without me." Daniels glared at her, chest rising and falling with anger. Without another word, he shoved the scissors onto the table and stormed out of the room. The second he was gone, Lily let out a shaky breath, her body trembling from the ordeal. Her scalp burned where he had wrenched her hair. Sergeant Williams crouched beside her, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" Tears welled up in Lily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I just want my dad." Williams nodded, her expression softening. She reached for the phone. "We're calling him now." Before she could dial, another officer stepped into the room, Captain Johnson. A tall, broad-shouldered black man with a no-nonsense demeanor. His sharp gaze flit between Lily and Williams. "Where's Daniels?" Johnson asked, his voice low. "Gone," Williams replied. "He tried to," she exhaled, shaking her head. "It's handled." Johnson turned to Lily, his face softening slightly. "You okay, kid?" Lily could barely speak. Her voice choked. She just nodded. Johnson's expression softened further, his voice quieter now. "Your dad's on his way." Lily exhaled in relief, but that relief was short-lived. Suddenly, Daniels reappeared in the doorway, his usual smug grin in place. "Judge Thompson just arrived," he announced, as if it were some trivial detail. "Let's see if he can talk his way out of this one." Williams' head snapped up in surprise. "Wait, Judge Thompson?" Daniels grinned wider. "That's right." And for the first time since she had been brought in, Lily saw something flicker in Daniels' eyes: fear. Because he had just arrested the daughter of one of the most influential judges in the state, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted in an instant. The usual murmur of ringing phones and paperwork rustling died down as an imposing figure stepped through the front entrance. Judge Elijah Thompson. 6'3", broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that made it clear he was not a man to be taken lightly. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room, his lips pressed into a tight line, radiating controlled fury. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Officer Daniels straightened, but his confident smirk faltered when he saw the figure standing at the door. "Judge T, good evening," he stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. Judge Elijah Thompson didn't answer. His eyes scanned the room, but they didn't linger on anyone else. They landed directly on Lily. There she was, small, fragile-looking. Her jacket was wrinkled, and her wrists were red from the cuffs. Though she tried to stay composed, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. His hands balled into fists, and the air in the room seemed to crackle with his intensity. "Lily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But those two words hit her like a freight train. In just 3 strides, he was at her side. His large hands cupped her face with gentle care, his eyes scanning her, taking in every inch of her like he was making sure she was still whole. "Lily," his voice was soft but firm, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her eyes flicked toward Danielle's. Elijah followed her gaze, and then, as if the room had shifted in an instant, his entire demeanor changed, slow, calculated, and dangerous. His eyes locked onto Danielle's, who now looked anything but smug. "You arrested my daughter?" Elijah asked, his voice even, devoid of emotion. Danielle's tried to shrug it off, his voice faltering. She matched the. Elijah stepped forward, the air around him crackling with fury. "You arrested my daughter?" Danielle's swallowed, his throat dry. She fit the description of a missing person. Elijah cut him off, his voice quiet, but with an undeniable authority. "Did you confirm her identity before laying a hand on her?" Danielle's hesitated. Silence hung heavy in the room. Then, with a deadly calm, Elijah tilted his head. "You didn't." The entire room held its breath. Danielle's tried to recover, stammering. She resisted detainment. Elijah turned to Captain Johnson, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Did my daughter resist arrest?" Johnson didn't hesitate for even a second. "No, sir. She was cooperative." Elijah's nostrils flared, the anger in him palpable. "So she was handcuffed, detained, and nearly assaulted based on what? Officer Daniels." A hunch. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. And then Elijah dropped the final blow, his voice colder than ice. "I want all the security footage, every second of it. Now." Captain Johnson nodded and motioned to Sergeant Williams. "Get it pulled." Daniels went pale, his earlier bravado vanishing in an instant. Elijah crossed his arms, his gaze cold and commanding. "You work for me now, Daniels," his voice like ice, "and you just put your entire career in my hands." For the first time that night, Lily felt a sense of safety. But she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. It took just 20 minutes for the footage to be pulled. 20 minutes for the entire precinct to witness exactly what had transpired in that back room. The screen flickered to life, showing Daniels gripping Lily's hair, yanking her head back, the flash of silver scissors in his hand. The room went silent. Lily Thompson stood at the front of the monitor, arms folded, jaw clenched, eyes locked onto the screen. As the video played, no one spoke, no one moved. Every officer in the room understood exactly what was happening. They knew the consequences. When the footage ended, Captain Johnson exhaled sharply, turning toward Elijah. "Sir, Elijah held up his hand, silencing him. "No." His voice was low and steady, unwavering. "I want to hear from him." He turned to Daniels, who was now visibly sweating. "You want to explain?" Elijah's voice was sharp, controlled. "Or should we just go straight to internal affairs?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if hoping anyone would step in to defend him. But no one did, not even Sergeant Williams. Daniels cleared his throat. "I was just following standard procedures." Elijah took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "What procedure justifies putting your hands on my daughter like that?" Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What procedure justifies attempting to cut off a child's hair?" Elijah's voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words pressed down on everyone in the room. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression cold. "That's what I thought." Then he turned to Captain Johnson. "I want his badge. Now." Johnson didn't hesitate. He immediately reached for his radio. "Get you down here." Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is relieved of duty pending investigation. Daniels's face drained of color. "Wait, badge and gun." Now, Johnson's voice was firm, final. Daniels's hands trembled as he unlatched the badge from his uniform and set it down on the table with an audible clink. Then, slowly, he removed his holster, placing the gun beside it. Elijah tilted his head, his expression steely. "You think this ends here?" Daniels looked up, panic flashing in his eyes. "Judge Thompson, this precinct will be hearing from my lawyers." Elijah cut him off, his voice hard and unyielding. "And so will the media." At that, Daniels visibly flinched, his face paling. Elijah turned to Lily, his eyes softening for the first time since he had entered. "Come on, sweetheart, we're going home." Lily didn't need to be told twice. She practically ran to her father's side, gripping his hand tightly as he led her toward the exit. As they walked out, every officer in the room was left staring at Daniels. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. But just because he lost his badge didn't mean the fight for justice was over. Not yet. The story broke that same night. By the time Elijah and Lily made it home, news anchors were already dissecting the footage. The headlines were everywhere. Phoenix officer under investigation for assault on 13-year-old girl. Police precinct faces backlash after attempted forced haircut. Judge's daughter wrongfully detained. Internal Affairs launches investigation. The video spread like wildfire. People shared it, reposted it, demanded answers. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the Phoenix Police Department. Protesters, community leaders, even local politicians. They weren't just angry, they were furious. Lily sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, watching it all unfold. It felt surreal seeing her own face on the screen, hearing people chant her name in the streets. Her father sat beside her, his phone buzzing constantly, calls from lawyers, reporters, even the mayor's office. But his attention was on her. "You okay, sweetheart?" His voice was softer now, not the sharp edge it had carried in the precinct. Lily shrugged, not knowing how to answer. "I just don't get it." Elijah frowned, concern deepening in his eyes. "What don't you get?" She swallowed, her voice quieter. "Why? Why did he do it?" Elijah exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "Because some people think they can do whatever they want to us. That they won't face consequences." Lily chewed her lip, still uncertain. "But he is, right?" Elijah's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. "He's under investigation, that's a start." But investigations weren't justice, not yet. And sure enough, just 3 days later, the precinct released a statement. "While Officer Daniels' actions were inappropriate, we have found no criminal wrongdoing. He will be placed on unpaid leave until further review." Unpaid leave. That was it. Lily's stomach twisted as she watched the reporters announce it on TV. "So he just gets to go home?" she asked, her voice hollow. Elijah didn't answer immediately. His grip on his phone tightened as he stared at the screen. "For now," he said finally. "But we're not done," and he meant it, because the very next day, Lily Thompson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the department. And this time, the whole world was watching. Because this wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was about every child of color who had ever been humiliated, violated, or treated as though they were invisible. And whether Officer Daniels knew it or not, he had just ignited a battle he couldn't win. Justice isn't automatic, it isn't guaranteed. And for people like Lily, it's often a constant fight just to be heard. She wasn't the first to go through this, and sadly, she wouldn't be the last. But what made her story different was who was watching. She had a father who refused to back down, a community that stood beside her. Millions of voices demanding accountability, and that's the real power. Not in the system but in the people who refuse to allow injustice to stand. Lily's story is proof that when we stand up, speak out, and fight back, change is possible. So ask yourself, if you saw this happening to someone else, would you stay silent, or would you be the voice that finally makes a difference? Because real change starts when we refuse to look away.